Hi everyone, Robert Skidelsky joined us today, a professor emeritus of political economy, an author, and also member of the House of Lords of the United Kingdom. So it's a great privilege to speak with you. I've read your stuff, I've seen your interviews, so it's wonderful to finally speak with you.
Good to be good to be on your program.
Well, I wanted to start off with the British policies towards Ukraine because much of Europe has been quite hostile to diplomacy and indeed seem to favor like seemingly going for victory. But this has been going on now for more than 3 years, and I was wondering how you're reading the situation in Britain. What is the aversion to pursuing a diplomatic path, and why do we seem so convinced that this war has to be won?
Well, I mean, that's an excellent point. It was right from the beginning. It was glory to Ukraine, and there's got to be a Ukrainian victory, and there's no talking or no peace negotiations possible except on Ukrainian terms. And I think that has been remains the view. I mean, I don't think I think they've abandoned the talk of victory, but it's the peace has got to be on Ukrainian terms, and therefore I think they're actually well, and by Ukrainian terms, that necessarily means, I think, terms unacceptable to Russia. So they know that there's some agreement about something, but basically unacceptable to Russia. So by taking up that position, what they're saying is we don't want this war to end. And what they're actually doing is to put obstructions in the way of the Trump Putin efforts to end the war by an agreement between Russia and America. I mean, I think that's the game going on at the moment. They're sort of obstructing the peace talks because they don't actually want the war to end except on Ukrainian terms.
Well, I've seen a lot of these narratives and how they I guess have a very unfortunate outcome. That is, before the Russian invasion, when we say no security guarantees, kind of left the military as the preferable options for the Russians. And also when we say we won't have peace before the Russians pull out, it effectively means there won't be any peace. And same as when we promise, that they will get NATO membership after the war, we're signaling to the Russian that they have to annex all the territories, which you don't want to end up in the hands of NATO. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of what we say sounds good, but it ends up with terrible consequences. But do you see this as a deliberate strategy, though, to prolong the war?
You never really know how much is deliberate and how much is stupidity. I mean, it's often hard to distinguish that. There is a narrative, and people are used to it. They learn it by heart, and therefore, when the actual events go in a different direction, they don't quite know how to change their narrative, and they go on really like you know hens with their heads cut off. They go on doing the same thing. And so it's a mixture of the two. But undoubtedly, I mean, think of this one thing, the idea of the coalition of the willing sending troops from Britain, France, maybe Poland, but anyway, some other Scandinavian countries maybe, to police the ceasefire when Russia has endlessly said we don't want NATO anywhere near Ukraine. Now, that's set up to be rejected, isn't it? I mean, I can't believe that they intended that seriously. Were they deliberately intending to sabotage the talks, or were they desperately trying to make Europe relevant to what was going on without quite abandoning their previous positions? It's hard to know what goes on in their mind. Again, we must intensify sanctions. We must seize the frozen Russian assets, which Britain and France want to do. It's being resisted by one or two others. That 200 billion of assets. Now, those are acts of war. They're not acts of diplomacy. So, what do you make of it? You make your choice. I think it's deliberate. I think it's a deliberate attempt to sabotage any possibility that American-Russian negotiations might be successful.
Well, yeah, our political leaders in this country do the same. They say, well, we may have to contribute peacekeepers into Ukraine to contribute to the peace, but
Yeah,
what it actually means is to sabotage the peace because there can't be
yeah.
any negotiations or peace if the threat of introducing soldiers from NATO countries into Ukraine hangs over them.
The
But
words people use are terribly important. I mean, one's got to get behind them. Because, of course, we all want peace, don't we? We all want peace, and the sooner the better. But we have to have a peace that leaves the status of the four Russian speaking oblasts sort of somewhat indeterminate, that still provides a role for NATO, which still, in a way, demands Russia pay reparations. And what about bringing the Russian government to trial in the International Court for war crimes? Well, we haven't got that out of our heads quite. But you see, what's the position? I mean, it seems to me they haven't said let's go behind the Trump efforts, certainly try to improve them, but be constructive in that way. Instead, it's a different strategy they're pursuing.
what is this strategy? Because I think it's a growing recognition now that we are losing this war, and if we can't win, and we see that the Ukrainians are losing more men every day, more territory, more equipment, which can't be replaced, especially now that the Americans are pulling out. What exactly, what is the strategy? What is the coalition of the willing? An unfortunate term, I would add. Uh, what are the possible objectives? Or is this only self-delusion at this point?
Well, it's not clear what the objectives are. There is a wave of Russophobia, and if you read the mainstream commentators, what is at stake is the future of Europe. Russia is an expansionist power. It's not just that it wants to recreate the old empire surrounding, but it would go further if allowed to. So this is a battle for Europe, but it's a very strange battle for Europe because it's a battle for Europe to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. So Ukraine is actually not the main actor in a way in this grand narrative. It's simply, you could say, almost the sacrificial victim. Um, but the main plot is the anti-Russian plot. And Russia is a danger. It's an autocracy. Autocracies are aggressive, and we, the democracies, have to resist them. Um, and Ukraine happens to be the particular point at which there is some resistance, but it could be Moldova, it could be Georgia, it could be Estonia. Um, so if you think of it in those terms, if that's your view of the situation, then I mean the strategy is simply to resist at any point at which this Russian bear tries to attack you. I don't think it's anything more sophisticated than that. I should say, by the way, in my view and that of many experts, this is not what Russia is about. I mean, it seems to me Russia's always wanted weak neighbors. That's historically going back to the 19th century. We now call them maybe buffer states or something like that. But it hasn't wanted to conquer, Europe, even a large part of Europe. It hasn't wanted to do that. So I think that the strategy, insofar as it is to resist the Russian offensive, is misguided and stops the real possibilities of peace.
Was Walter Lippmann famously wrote a century ago on propaganda that in terms of presenting the world as a struggle between good and evil, he said it had a positive effect of mobilizing the public or getting their consent for war, but he said the disadvantage was it becomes impossible to reach a workable peace. Because if
Yeah.
you think you're in a struggle of good versus evil, I guess compromise becomes appeasement, which sounds very much like the way we speak today.
Yeah. And that, of course, is one of the weaknesses of democracy. Once they um, accept a certain kind of narrative, it becomes a moral crusade, and it's very hard to stop them. Here's a nice quote, if I may give you, from 1836. 1836, John Stuart Mill claimed in an essay that the government had become smitten with the epidemic disease of Russophobia, an irrational panic that had triggered an unnecessary increase in defense spending. So this is how it goes. You have the Russophobia. They're about to come. Therefore, that enables you to get higher defense spending through your government, through Parliament in this case, and all the left and the right can unite on this thing. There is this external menace. We have to spend more on defense. Therefore, and on that point, left and right can be in complete agreement because it's a national security issue. One of my ideas is that we're going to have what's now called military Keynesianism. Military Keynesianism coming to Western Europe as they loosen the fiscal rules in order. They've already done that in Germany in order to expand defensively. To meet what? To meet what? The threat of Russia.
Well, in the 1830s, you also had Richard Cobden in Britain who released the pamphlet of Russophobia. And that was the same warning that,
Yeah.
yes, we have legitimate security concerns about Russia, but he said this rampant, irrational fear and hatred of Russia that this led to misspending and also, yeah, policies which weren't ideal. In other words, bad for Britain.
Yeah,
But
I
these
mean,
days he would be called a puppet of Putin, perhaps. So-
yeah. But you see, also in the Cold War, there was the same. There was also Russia being the big enemy, wanting to conquer Europe and dominate the world in some way. But in fact, a lot of the recent work on the Cold War has said this wasn't actually Stalin's intention. He certainly wanted big buffers, but he wasn't actually interested in taking over the rest of Germany, France, Italy, Britain, and so on. And so again, what you had was this argument for military spending based on the Russian threat, and it led even Eisenhower in 1961 to warn against the military-industrial complex that was, seizing, having much too much influence on policy.
So, what are the sources of why did this war start, and what is the reason? Yeah, what has triggered this war, and also what are the Russian objectives?
Well, I think Russia, ever since the fall of Soviet Union, Russia has objected to the eastward expansion of NATO. I think that's been a consistent line. And they say that Gorbachev was promised not 1 inch further east when he agreed to the reunification of Germany. I think all that's pretty well established. But why did they finally take military action? By the way, I think the military operation was profoundly misguided on Putin's part. It was miscalculated. I think they thought they could win or get their objectives very, very quickly before any real global repercussions needed to be worried about. I think that was wrong. They underestimated the extent of Ukrainian resistance. So it was miscalculated, and they also got, as one result of it was 2 extra members of NATO. So the policy wasn't right, but what started it, I think, what brought it to the moment of invasion were the events of 2014 in Ukraine. I think the Russians had always, up till then, from 1990 to 2014, basically been able to manipulate Ukrainian domestic politics so that it was a weak neighbor. It was a weak neighbor. And then you had this Maidan uprising in 2014. Was that a genuine popular uprising against Poroshenko, who was the president at the time, or was it a CI manipulated event? And the Russians, of course, believe it was entirely CI manipulated event, that it was part of NATO's eastward expansion. You get rid of any pro-Russian forces within Ukraine, and then Ukraine simply joins NATO at some point in the future. I think that's the Russian interpretation of what was happening. And so that led to the first attack, which was the siege of Crimea in 2014. But then later on, what the Russians saw as Zelensky's refusal to implement Minsk II, which was to set up a proper self-governing arrangements for the four Russian provinces, and his rejection of that. And it seems, in their view, his attempt to de-Russianize those bits. That then led to the actual invasion. I think there's something in the Russian narrative. I mean, why shouldn't there be? I mean, the Russians wanted to Russianize Ukraine in all the times they were there. And now Ukraine wants to Ukrainianize Ukraine. And I don't think you have to postulate that these are Nazis, which I think is, a rather unprepossessing and unplausible line. But they want to create a Ukrainian Ukraine. And there happen to be quite a lot of Russians there. So either the Russians go somewhere into Russia, or Ukrainians try to, make them into Ukrainians. And so I think that was the origins of the thing. I don't think it was any idea. I don't think behind it was a serious attempt to restore the Russian Empire or restore Soviet Union. And these were ideas. Yeah, if the opportunities are there, we might think of doing that. But it wasn't a project. I think the project was to stop NATO in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, it's until 2014. This is when only 20% of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. And indeed, for the Ukrainian security services, their main partner was Russia. And we saw also among the polling that if the Ukrainians had to choose a foreign partner, then Russia was the favored one. However, a year ago, the New York Times, they published an article which they wrote that on the first day after the toppling of Yanukovych, the new intelligence chief of Ukraine, which walked into office, the first thing he did was to pick up a phone to call CIA and MI6 to form a trilateral partnership against Russia. So it seems, and it also confirmed that this was to a large extent what triggered or created very deep concerns in Russia, that this was not merely us aspiring to advance the democracy of Ukraine, or
Yeah.
but
Well, you see, I mean, I think the Russians are not going to. I mean, one of the things I've endlessly said is that this is not a total Russian victory by any means. I mean, and it's considerable victory for Ukraine. First of all, its resistance has been very, very remarkable. And secondly, it's turned most of Ukraine anti-Russian. I mean,
yeah,
you say you report the earlier finding that they saw Russian as a partner. But if you bomb a country to smithereens for 3 years, they're not going to regard you as a friend. Of course not. I mean, and so what Russia has actually achieved is the creation of a properly independent Ukraine. And we should actually recognize that when we say, oh, we mustn't let Russia get away with it. Russia hasn't got away with it.
oh, I think that's a good point. Yeah, they say nations are born in wars, and I think
Yeah, yeah.
this is to a large extent true here too, as because yeah, if you would do these polls today about NATO, definitely they do not look like they do in 2014, and I think this has been a key. Yeah, well, one of the miscalculation or mistakes, as you said. You also mentioned the miscalculation that the Russians thought they were going to come in and get this sorted out very quickly in 2022, but I think the Russians also recognized this at this point, that it was a miscalculation, because on the first day after the invasion, Zelensky himself confirmed that the Russians had contacted him on the first day of the invasion to start negotiations on neutrality, but that never happened, and they thought that he would accept this. But what do you read into the argument that again, the Israeli and Turkish mediators, they said that it was Boris Johnson, representing also the United States and UK, who came in and put the pressure on abandoning the Istanbul talks?
I think there's a lot in that. I don't know how. There were some issues still to be negotiated, but the negotiations at Ankara had reached a point when they would have gone up to right to the top to sort out final details if that was possible. And then there is a lot of evidence that when Boris Johnson, British Prime Minister, went to Kiev on the 6th of April 2022, he saw Zelensky and said, look, you can make peace if you want, but we're not going to necessarily endorse the peace you make. And if you don't make peace, we will go on supplying you with the weapons of resistance. Now, there's a lot of evidence. Now, people say, well, how could Boris Johnson? He didn't have any particular role. But the promise that NATO would go on supplying Ukraine with arms was a very, very powerful inducement not to make peace at that point. Because at that point, there was a sort of balance almost. Russia had not really succeeded in its aims, but it wasn't going to get any further. I mean, immediately. And so there was a chance, there was a point of balance in the military situation, that moment then, when you could have when they might have talked. Then that balance disappeared after that. The Ukrainians then started to gain ground, they lost interest. And then of course, again, the peace idea started again in 2024 because of the stalemate on the battlefield. When peace is hot and cold, depends enormously on what's going on the ground and who thinks they're getting a better deal. And I'm sure the Russians are delaying the peace process now a little bit, not too much, in order to get as much ground as they can, more ground as they can before the ceasefire is signed.
I think you're probably very right on this, but also I think this is the narrative when we say that supplying the weapons is the pro-Ukrainian, the supportive things to do. I think it's and opposing it then would be de facto taking the side of Russia. But I think people miss the fact that supplying the weapons was exactly had the purpose of avoiding a diplomatic settlement. And given that we now see the utter destruction, the devastation that has been laid upon Ukraine, it's I tend to challenge the whole idea that this was pro-Ukrainian to begin with. This was been devastating as opposed to what they could have achieved in a negotiation in Istanbul, of course, which the Russians would have pulled back in return for neutrality.
Yeah. I mean, that was a key moment in February, March 2022. I've written about it and called it the lost peace. And I think a lot of people agree with that view, that there was a missed opportunity there. And now, I mean, why at this point say, look, at the moment when diplomacy is possible again, why say let's freeze 200, not freeze, but confiscate $200 billion worth of Russian assets? I mean, that's not a peace approach. That's intensifying war. I mean, sanctions are weapons of war. They were ideal for countries who wanted to display a huge amount of moral indignation without having to fight. But all the evidence is that they haven't worked. They very rarely worked unless it's in conjunction with actual fighting. And what's more, that they've strengthened the Russian economy. They've created, the economic sanctions have created a Russian war economy. Now, there's a profound miscalculation on the West's part.
It's hard to get around how the failures of the sanctions worked. Anyways, thank you so much.